Let's take a look at procedures. How do we handle batch processes and other similar processes that are necessary in any application? Since those processes can't be inferred based on a knowledge base, it's necessary to use some type of language, and GeneXus provides a very high-level language for this. First of all, we'll create two new transactions, the passenger and flight instance transactions. So I go to Object, right-click, New Object, and let's define the passenger transaction. So we create passenger ID and passenger name, and save. And now let's create the flight instance transaction. This is so we can create define an instance of a flight. So I add flight instance ID and we'll also include the flight to which this instance belongs, which is flight ID. And we'll also include the flight departure time. Let's also have the date and time of this flight instance date, and flight instance time. And this will be a date time. We'll also define a flight instance number of passengers attribute, so we know the passenger capacity for this instance. This will be a numeric 4. And now we're going to define a second level corresponding to passengers. So I include passenger ID and passenger name. And we'll also have a seat number for each passenger, which will be flight instance passenger seat number. And this will be a numeric 4. We save the changes, and we'll define the flight instance number of passengers attribute, which tells us the number of passengers on this flight instance as a formula. So the formula is count, parentheses, and I insert the attribute we just created, counting the seat number, and click OK and save. Now that we've already defined our flight instance transaction, let's think about the following situation. Let's imagine that for some reason all flights to a certain city in a specific country that are scheduled for a certain date and time have to be rescheduled for a different date and time. How would we solve this requirement? We would have to modify the values of the flight instance date and flight instance time attributes. One way would be to create a work with flight instance, filter the records that are scheduled for a specific date and time, and then access the flight instance transaction in update mode and modify the flight instance date and time by inserting different values. That would be the manual way, but there is also another possibility. This is through a web panel. We can ask the user to specify the flights to a city and country that are scheduled for a certain date and time, and have him or her enter the new date and time values. And then we could trigger a process that executes the changes automatically. Let's take a look at how this would be implemented. When we talk about procedures, we are referring to a new type of GeneXus object. This will receive as parameters the country, city, date, and time of the flights that have to be modified, and a new date and the new time. So let's define this new object. So I right-click, New Object, and we select a procedure, and we'll call it Flight Instance New Date. So first of all, we'll declare the parameters this procedure must receive in order to carry out the necessary changes. So we'll have to define the corresponding variables that will later be declared through the parm rule. So we select the Variables tab, and first we'll define the country ID variable. And then the city ID variable. Since these attributes with the same names already exist, the variables will be defined based on those attributes. So now let's define current instance date and current instance time. These will be here in order to store the current date and time. This will be a date time. And we'll define the new date and time that will be assigned to these flight instances. So we enter new instance date, and note that the data type was set automatically since our attribute's name ends with date. And we also have new instance time. We save, and now let's declare the parm rule. So we have parm parentheses, and we start listing our parameters, which will all be entry parameters. So we'll say in colon, and we'll enter the variable. Let's start with country ID. When we type the ampersand, which identifies the variables, we are automatically offered the list of variables that have already been defined for the flight instance new date procedure object. So I add country ID, comma. We have another variable, city ID. Now current instance date, current instance time, new instance date, and new instance time. I close the parentheses and add a semicolon. We save the changes, and we've declared our parm rule. When this process is called by a web panel, the parameters will have to be passed in the same order in which they've been declared here. So let's take a look at this procedure's source. It's our goal to modify the values of certain attributes, but to do so we'll have to access a table, and for that we'll need a command that will allow us to access the tables. The GeneXus command that allows us to access tables is the forEach command. This forEach command ends with end4. The forEach command will allow us to navigate a physical table and access the extended table of that physical table. How does GeneXus determine which physical table the forEach will navigate? It figures it out by seeing what attributes are within this forEach. We need to find all of the flight instances that correspond to the city and country we are receiving as parameters and whose date and time is equal to what we are receiving through the current instance date and time variables. Then, we need to modify those date and time values and set them to the values stored in the new instance date and time variables. So we'll start by listing our conditions here. We'll define our conditions by using where. So let's start by typing it, where and I'll choose flight departure country ID is equal to the country ID variable, and where the flight departure city ID is equal to the city ID variable. So we are determining the flight instances for a specific city and a specific country. So now let's have where flight instance date is equal to the current instance date variable, and where the flight instance time is equal to our current instance time variable. For those records that fulfill these conditions, we will modify the flight instance date value. And we'll assign it the value of our new instance date variable. And the flight instance time attribute will be equal to the new instance time variable. So let's clean up the formatting a little bit and save our changes. GeneXus will determine the base table to be navigated based on the attributes mentioned within the where clauses and within the body of the for each. It will search for the smallest extended table that contains those attributes. Here, it will be the extended table that contains flight departure country ID, city ID, and flight instance date and time. So I'll create the table diagram so we can see what the base table will be. So we select flight instance, flight instance passenger, flight, country city, country, I had attraction category and attraction, and now airline, and we finally add passenger. And now we've completed our table diagram. The following attributes have been declared within our procedures source: flight instance date, flight instance time, and also flight departure country ID, and flight departure city ID. So we have attributes from the flight table and from the flight instance table. We said that GeneXus will search for the smallest extended table that will contain all the attributes. What will the smallest extended table be? In this case, it's flight instance. Navigating flight instance, we can access the flight departure country ID and city ID attributes through the flight ID attribute, which is a foreign key in that table. Let's return to our procedure. And now we know that flight instance is the base table of this for each. And let's talk a little bit more of the for each command. We already know that for each is a command to access tables, and that every for each navigates not only one physical table, but also its extended table. That base table is determined, as we have already seen, by those attributes that are present within the where clause and the order clause. The order clause will allow us to indicate the order in which we want the records to be traversed. If we do not specify an order, the table's primary key will be used by default. The attributes within the Define By clause are also taken into account. This Define By clause lets us define an attribute or set of attributes that will indicate to GeneXus which table we want to traverse. The attributes that have been declared within the body of the for each are also taken into account. Within a for each, we can do more than just modify records, as we've seen in our example. We can also insert records by using the new command, and we can also delete records by using the delete command. At the beginning of this course, when we were introducing this IDE, this integrated development environment, we said that it was an intuitive and contextual environment. Note that right now we are looking at a procedure's source. If we click on the menu bar's Insert option, we see all these options which the IDE offers us, and they are called code snippets. These code snippets will allow us to write our own code in a much clearer and simpler way. If, for example, I select this snippet that reads for each where, GeneXus offers us the for each structure along with the where clause. We just need to determine the conditions for the where clause, and then we can declare the code for this for each. So right now let's work on a new requirement. We'd like to list